Good evening. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's discussion entitled World on the Brink, China, America, and the New Cold War with Dmitri Alperovitch. Dmitri is this semester's Kurt Fiermet's distinguished visitor. So last night, in this very same room, we discussed America's internal issues and the future of our democracy. We were deep in the muck and the mire of democratic politics. But as plenty of countries have found out the hard way, the external environment doesn't take a pause while we deal with our internal problems. And so tonight we moved to the high plains of strategy in an effort to deal with both at the same time. Tonight, Dmitri and I will discuss the high stakes, one might say existential rivalry between the United States and China, the future of U.S. foreign policy in Asia and Europe, the impact of technology on this geopolitical rivalry, and within this framework, how the Russia-Ukraine war is situated in this context, and where Dmitri thinks it is going. Before I introduce our speaker, let me say a few words about the Kurt Fiermet's distinguished visitorship. It was established in honor of the late Kurt Fiermet's, former vice chairman of J.P. Morgan, in recognition of his exceptional career in international finance and his dedication to the transatlantic relationship. It was inaugurated way back in 2008 to bring outstanding U.S. individuals to the Academy for an in-depth exchange with German colleagues, counterparts, and the interested public. Previous Kurt Fiermet's visitors include former Secretary of the Treasury Lawrence Summers, Adam Posen, and Fred Bergston from the Peterson Institute of International Economics, David Lipton and John Lipsky of the International Monetary Fund, Todd Stern, the former Special Envoy for Climate Change at the State Department, and former Assistant Secretary of State and President of Refugees International, Eric Schwartz. Anyway, it's a great and special honor to be able to welcome tonight's Kurt Fiermet speaker, Dmitri Alperovitch, one of the world's leading voices on geopolitics, cybersecurity, and international security writ large. Dmitri has a remarkable story. Today, he is best known as the co-founder and chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator, a geopolitical think tank that addresses policy challenges in the field of national security, trade, cybersecurity, AI, resources, and energy. And as someone whose writings appear in such places as Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, and other similar publications. His recent book, the bestseller, World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century, makes a very strong case that we are, whether we know it or not, and whether we like it or not, deep into a new kind of Cold War. One every bit as serious as the last one, and one that will be fought not just with weapons, but with technology, trade, and ideas. The book I will vouch for is very lucid, packed with lots of fascinating history, excellent ideas, and all kinds of interesting observations, which is why The Economist picked it as one of its books of the year in 2024. Dmitri's emergence as a leading geopolitical analyst follows on his remarkable success as the co-founder and former chief technology officer of CrowdStrike, a leading cybersecurity company that helped investigate some of the highest profile cyber attacks in recent history. He has also founded the Alperovitch Institute for Cybersecurity Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He was a founding member of the U.S. government's Cyber Safety Review Board, which conducts reviews of major cyber incidents that affect national security. And one of the things that makes Dmitri so interesting a commentator is that he was born in Russia, came to the United States, I think in his early teens, and brings a perspective that is rooted in the experience of both worlds. He is another immigrant, I'm happy to underscore, who has made a tremendous contribution to American life and thought.
Immigrants, we get the job done.
Excellent. By the way, has anyone seen that list? So, admittedly, they're not all from the former Soviet Union, but the list of American CEOs from India, it's actually, I feel like we're kind of stupid. Anyway, it's worth noting that together with his father, he founded his first company, which dealt with encryption when he was all of 14. Luckily, my kids have made it into their 20s, so I'm not going to hold that over them. Today, he is a renowned expert on global security. He advises governments, corporations, and the public on the rivalry between China and the US and what that means for the rest of the world. And if after tonight you want to hear more of Dmitri, he has a podcast entitled Geopolitics Decanted, which is dedicated to expert analysis of the most pressing national security challenges of our time. So tonight's lecture, World on the Brink, could hardly be more timely as global power dynamics shift in real time, or sometimes even in accelerated time, it seems. As Europe deals with a horribly draining war on its doorstep, as an American administration redefines the nation's role in the world, Dmitri challenges us to think strategically about how democracies can respond and how the transatlantic community fits into this new era of competition. I would just add that tonight's discussion continues the Academy's effort to engage seriously on the issue of China. That goes back to a series of workshops conducted virtually in the plague year of 2020. Those workshops were led by Liz Economy, one of America's foremost China experts, who later came to Berlin as a distinguished visitor, and it's included other speakers such as Odd-Arne Westad, the terrific Yale professor, and most recently, China cyber expert Sam Sachs, who was here just at the last end of the semester. So I'm going to ask Dmitri to join me up on stage. Our discussion will last about 35 minutes, and then we will hand it over to you for the Q&A. If you're here at the Academy, raise your hand in the traditional manner and wait for the microphone. Please wait for the microphone. And there will be extra prizes for short questions and for ones that have question marks at the end. And if you're following on the stream, type your question into the online Q&A. So Dmitri, welcome.
By the way, I was told this is business casual, so sorry for not wearing a tie.
No apologies needed. So why don't we just, I'll toss you the appropriate softball to start with. Tell me about this new Cold War you're focusing on.
Yeah, I've been focused on this for well over 15 years now. I've been convinced that we are in a new Cold War with China. And, you know, before writing this book, I had the thinking that this was going to be a very different Cold War from the first one. And the more I dug into the history, particularly of the first Cold War, the more I started to appreciate how remarkably similar the two conflicts are on almost every level. Right? You have a global competition for supremacy playing out in every corner of the world, not just in the Indo-Pacific between the United States and China. You have an arms race. There's both conventional and nuclear. Both countries are modernizing their nuclear arsenals, and China is rapidly expanding theirs. You have preparations for war. You go talk to Sam Paparo, Admiral of Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii. His hair is on fire because of the fear that on his watch he will have to fight China. The Chinese are preparing for the same thing. You have economic warfare that's being waged, and not just something that started under Donald Trump and tariffs, but something that Chinese have been prosecuted against the United States for 25 years. And I was on the front lines of that for many years in the cyber domain, where they were stealing everything that was not bolted down from virtually every Western company that's of any note, intellectual property, trade secrets, and the like.
And government.
But on the economic fronts in particular. And perhaps you have a space race, by the way. Does that sound familiar? We're trying to get to the moon before the Chinese do. A remarkable similarity there as well. You have a race for bases both in the region and broader, both for the United States. We're back in the Philippines since the early 90s when we left, and we now have access to a raid bases there, and the Chinese are building up capabilities in Djibouti and Cambodia, Pakistan, etc. And perhaps most importantly, you have a regional flashpoint that can take both of these powers into conflict. During the first Cold War, that was primarily West Berlin, right? The one place where there was a real danger, aside from a short period in October of 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was actually an outgrowth of the West Berlin crisis in 1961. But for much of that early period, this was the place where American troops were facing Soviet troops, and you had a distinct threat of both conventional and potentially nuclear escalation. Today, that is Taiwan. And the threat that is growing by the day, that Xi Jinping, I believe, will want to take Taiwan on his watch. Obviously, this has been a long-standing objective of every leader of the PRC, going back to Mao, to take Taiwan and reunify it, as they call it, with the PRC. Xi Jinping, I think, is different in that he wants to be the leader that is going to be ultimately eclipsing Mao's historical presence. He wants to go down into the pantheon of Chinese history as someone who's greater than Mao. And the only way to do that is to do the one thing that Mao couldn't do, which is take Taiwan. So I think, not unlike Putin, by the way, it's not enough for him to know that maybe one day China will unify with Taiwan. He wants to be the one that gets credit for it. Not unlike Putin, by the way, similarities between Ukraine and Taiwan are remarkable. Both of these men are in their 70s. In fact, Putin just turned 73 yesterday. I want to wish him happy birthday. Xi Jinping is 72 right now. Both are looking at this last decade in power, potentially. We've just seen in the United States what happens when leaders run in their 80s and mental acuities, health concerns start to intervene. So I do worry a great deal that he's going to run for re-election, obviously, almost certainly in 2027 as a leader of the Chinese Communist Party. That's going to be another 5-year term that's going to expire in 2032. And in 2032, he'll be 79. In the Chinese system, they don't tend to elect their leaders into their 80s. And as I said, health concerns, etc. may intervene. So I worry a great deal that he's going to enter this unprecedented fourth term in power in 2027, thinking that this is unfinished business that I need to finish in this 5-year period. And it's going to be a very, very dangerous 5-year period.
So I think the parallel between Xi and Putin are really interesting, and we'll get into that in a minute. The standard argument against the conflict with China, or the tensions with China, is during the first Cold War, it was a systemic competition. It was communism versus capitalism, or democratic capitalism. And now we are harnessed, in a sense, to the same horse, which is the world economy. And that even if, a hot war in both cases would have been unthinkable because of the nuclear dimension, isn't it suicidal and unimaginable that China would do that to itself? So, as I said, that's the standard counter. Why is the standard counter wrong?
Yeah. By the way, there's another piece in what you just said that's also wrong, and that
Thanks.
is it's a common misconception about the history of the first Cold War, and the idea that it was always about ideology. It was about ideology in the beginning. It was certainly about ideology with Lenin and Stalin. After Stalin's death in 1953, the idea of world revolution really ended. Khrushchev, certainly Brezhnev and Andropov, Chernenko, Gorbachev, all these leaders did not really care that much about spreading communism around the world. So it became much less of a threat in terms of, oh my God, the United States is going to become communist all of a sudden. So it became about great power competition, the fight for influence in various parts of the world, spheres of influence. And in fact, the United States explicitly rejected, during the detente in the 1970s, Brezhnev's offer to divide the world together. There's an incredible moment that my friend Sergei Radchenko, one of the premier Cold War historians, writes in his recent book, To Run the World, where Kissinger is in a log cabin on the outskirts of Moscow hunting with Brezhnev when they've just established the détente. This is right after Kissinger went to China, of course, opened up China, and then used that not to threaten the Soviet Union, as many people assume, but actually to push the Soviet Union into a détente with the United States. And Brezhnev, as they're hunting and drinking, tells Kissinger, why don't we, you and us, the Soviet Union, divide the world together? We can run the world together. And Kissinger explicitly rejects that. No, we are in a confrontation here. This is just a temporary peace, but our objective is to win this Cold War, right? We're not going to give you your sphere of influence and assume that that's how it's going to be. The Baltics are always going to be part of the Soviet Union and East Germany and so forth. And I think that that is actually very similar to what we have with China, that we have this confrontation that is global for influence, not just in the Indo-Pacific, first and foremost in the Indo-Pacific, but really globally. In terms of economics, look, it's very, very clear that Xi Jinping does not care about economics. You don't shut down your economy during COVID and practice zero COVID if you care about economy. Everything in China, including economics, is subservient first and foremost to the national objectives. And what is his top national objective? This is literally out of his speeches. You don't have to guess. It's the idea of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And what is the core tenet of that rejuvenation, according to Xi Jinping, not someone's analysis? It is the unification or reunification, as he calls it, with Taiwan. So this idea that economy is going to stop this guy from achieving the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation that they've been waiting on since the century of humiliation in the 1800s, I think is just nonsense. Secondly, this is not a man that really understands economics. In fact, he's done a lot of things that I think have been very detrimental to Chinese economics. And I think he is arrogant enough, just like Putin, by the way, to think that China is big enough that no one is going to disconnect from China, that it is self-sufficient enough that it can survive whatever sanctions regimes that may be put in place on them. And in fact, since coming to power, he's accelerated the push towards interdependence. In Russia, Putin called it import substitution. They have different words in China for this, but essentially the same principle that we're not going to be relying on the West. We want the West to be relying on us. Similar strategy to Russia. Putin thought that no one's going to care about Ukraine when Europe is dependent on Russian gas. He was deluded in that sense, and very likely that Xi Jinping is going to be deluded. To be seen whether he'll be right or wrong, but at least that's going to be his thinking, very likely.
Okay, so you're certainly right about the post-Stalin period. It was about geopolitical competition and all the rest, but he's still, in many ways, the threat to the Chinese system, and Chinese rulers are still in an indirect way accountable and mindful of their people. He has to be worried about what the consequences of an excessively confrontational policy would be.
I don't think he is showing any indications that he's worried. Right? There is a confrontational policy today with the United States. There is, in effect, a trade embargo against agricultural goods from the United States. Since the beginning of this year, China has not bought any soybeans from the United States. It was one of the largest markets for our farmers. Zero, right? So at least on the economics front, they've been in a very confrontational posture. The military is clearly preparing for conflict with us. On the cyber front, they're engaging not just in theft of everything that's not bolted down, but also into these intrusions that the U.S. government calls Volt Typhoon, which are intrusions into our critical infrastructure, into our water supply, electricity, port facilities, pipelines, financial sector, with the purpose not to steal, but to implant themselves in there so that one day they can pull the trigger and destroy those networks and affect our ability to both mobilize forces to flow to the Pacific, maybe even try to deter us from intervening in a conflict. That is actions that they're taking on a daily basis without concern for jeopardizing this relationship that supposedly he cares so much about.
So how did you come to believe that this Cold War is inevitable or already ongoing? I think it's an interesting story. So why don't you?
Yeah, so I spent the early part of my career in the cyber field, and I think cyber is fascinating because it obviously is this tool of national power that is used by nation states largely without direct attribution, at least overt attribution. So it gives you covert capabilities to project power overseas without the blowback typically that might be associated with this. And it often, as a result, functions a little bit like a canary in the coal mine that gives you insights into what adversaries are doing. So I first, and this directly led to me founding CrowdStrike, encountering Chinese nation state activity in 2010 when I was called by a little company you may have heard of called Google in 2010 to work with them on an investigation that I ultimately named Operation Aurora. There was an intrusion by the Chinese government into Google and turned out to be dozens of other companies from defense, agriculture, manufacturing, chemical industry, technology, etc., to both steal secrets and intellectual property, but in the case of Google, also to target dissidents, Tibetan activists, and others, and spy on them. And ever since then, I've been working on these investigations that showed the scope of this activity, how virtually every company of any consequence that is of interest to the Chinese government or their companies has been infiltrated, and everything that they've had has been stolen. I coined a phrase literally 15 years ago that there are only two types of companies: those that know that they've been hacked and those that don't yet know, but they've all been hacked. And it led me to sort of look at what is going on here and have conversations with senior government officials at the time who knew about this, were fully aware, but were unwilling to even acknowledge it publicly. No one in those days, except for me, was literally saying in public China and cyber in the same sentence, because we were still under this illusion that China is a friend. In 2015, President Obama, standing in the Rose Garden next to President Xi, said, "We welcome China's rise." I mean, how delusional is that? There's literally no one in DC on the Democratic or Republican side that would utter those words today, just 10 years later, right? But under those, concepts of, more trade with China is ultimately good. It will lead to liberalizing of their political system, and they'll be a friend. All of which has been proven false, of course. We were still in the "let's not rock the boat" mentality, but also we were delusional about the impact of this. I remember sitting in the sit room in the White House. You've been there many times, briefing the national security staff on the latest investigation I had done, and sort of almost like Khrushchev pounding the table of like, guys, we got to do something. This was 2011. And, the response from one of the senior directors on the NST was, "Oh, Dmitri, you're so naive. As long as they keep stealing, they won't innovate." I'm like, what are you smoking? And what history have you studied? I mean, I'll just give you one example that's the most obvious that, of course, you growing up in the Soviet Union, is that, the United States invents the atomic bomb with the Manhattan Project. The Soviets infiltrate the program, steal the secrets. They get to the hydrogen bomb first, right? With Sakharov inventing it independently, right? So theft helps you to take shortcuts, to know which routes not to take, and accelerates your own development. And now you are absolutely seeing China being leaders in energy technologies, with it, solar, batteries, EVs, telecommunications, right? It was initially jump-started with a lot of IP theft, both through cyber and non-cyber means with JVs that they force companies into and intellectual property transfers and the like. And then, sure enough, they accelerated, they captured market share, invested in R&D, they have a lot of smart people, and now they're leading in all these sectors. So it was very obvious to me that this was economic warfare that was being waged against us, that the U.S. government was not willing to admit. And this led me to directly start the company to highlight this and try to shame the government by doing these operations that they knew about. That, I wasn't revealing anything that they didn't already know about, but they were just not willing to disclose. And then looking broader beyond just IP theft, as you mentioned, the intrusions into government networks, the theft of defense materials, the theft of national security information, it was very clear that this is an adversary nation that wishes to do us harm, that is trying to find weaknesses in our military systems, that is trying to copy them, and is building a military for one purpose and one purpose only, which is to confront the United States in the Indo-Pacific, right? Unquestionably. The capabilities that they're building are directed towards that purpose. So it became very obvious to me that this is a Cold War that cyber illuminated, but goes well beyond cyber into every realm, whether it's economics, whether it's space, whether it's geopolitics and influence around the world, and obviously Taiwan itself.
Yeah, so let's expand on Taiwan. I think most of us are aware of the Chinese feeling that Taiwan is a continuing example of their humiliation in the past. You've actually elaborated on that considerably and show that there are a lot of strategic reasons why this is so important. Why don't you recap some of those?
Yeah, so let me say how I started writing this book. I started writing this book literally on February 24th, 2022. And the reason was that 3 months earlier, I was one of the first people to publicly say what is happening on the borders of Ukraine is something that's very different from what we've seen before. Putin is going to invade before the end of that winter. I said that in about mid-December of 2021. And when, unfortunately, the conflict came to fruition and Putin did invade, and I was doing my retrospective and I was thinking about the reasons that pushed him to do this, I realized that those exact reasons are taking place in the Indo-Pacific and driving Xi to take this action. So let me walk you through the similarities, right? So first of all, history. Both these men, Putin and Xi, have a distorted view of history that they believe that these nations, Ukraine and Taiwan, are not independent countries, that they belong to their respective empires, Russian and Chinese, right? Both are wrong. Obviously, in the case of Putin, I have an entire chapter on this in my book that debunking the Chinese case that Taiwan belonged to China. There's actually never been a single moment in Taiwanese history when whoever fully controlled Taiwan fully controlled China. Not one moment, right? In fact, the only foreign power that ever fully controlled...
The other way around. Whoever fully controlled China fully controlled Taiwan.
Okay, sorry, yeah.
So it's a small detail, but just, yeah.
In fact, if you were to make the case of historical ownership based on control, which I'm not making, by the way, the only power that did that was Japan. In 1895, it was able to capture Taiwan and control it through the end of World War II. Right? I'm not saying that Taiwan belongs to Japan, to be clear. So both of them are wrong, but nevertheless passionately believe in this case. They believe in both personal and their nation's destiny to one day reunify these lands, as we've talked about. There's also a security and geography element to this, right? So if you look at Ukraine, Ukraine has mattered to Russia's strategy for many, many centuries, right? It has been the pathway for invasions from Europe into Russia, certainly Hitler, Napoleon, Teutonic Knights, the Poles, you name it, over centuries. Most of these invaders went through either Ukraine or Belarus, right? And the Russians have always viewed those lands as borderlands, as buffer zones that would give them time to mobilize and protect Moscow from being overrun, at least in some cases. And then obviously from an offensive perspective, if you want to project power into Europe, it's really important to have these lands as well for power projection purposes, right? So Ukraine has always been viewed very strategically by Russia. Similar thinking happens inside the CCP and the PLA with regards to Taiwan. And I have this map in the book. It's very interesting. It's a little bit of an unusual map. So typically, you look at the map of the region. There's this huge landmass that is China, one of the largest countries on Earth, and this tiny speck of land next to it that is Taiwan. And you might naturally ask, why is that all that important and strategic? But if you rotate it, as we do, sort of 90 degrees, China on top, looking at the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, you see two fundamental dilemmas that they face. One, they're completely surrounded by U.S. military bases and allies, right? So from the Far East, you have the Korean Peninsula, half of it is South Korea, 28,000 American troops, air bases, some naval installations, radar installations, etc. Further down in that arc, you have the Japanese islands, headquarters to the U.S. Naval 7th Fleet, Marine Expeditionary Force on Okinawa, and a highly capable allied Japanese self-defense forces. On the other side of the arc, you have the Philippines in the South China Sea, where we are back getting access to Filipino military bases, deploying last year and originally for an exercise, but we kept it. The Typhoon intermediate range ballistic missile system that can range China. The Chinese are very, very nervous about. And in the center of that first island chain, the cork that keeps China bottled up is Taiwan, viewed as an outpost of US power. And so that's dilemma number one, that you're contained. And if you want to be a global superpower, that I think that clearly you want to be, you want to do what the United States did 100 years ago, which is establish a blue water navy that can traverse the world's oceans, secure your trade routes like we did for your commerce. You have to escape that containment and get out into the Pacific. And right now, all of these paths, either between Japan and Taiwan or Taiwan and the Philippines, are controlled, or even Malacca Strait down in the South China Sea, are controlled by US Navy. And at a moment's notice, we can blockade China and not only block their exports, which are existential to their economy, but also block their imports. And they import about 35% of their food, most of their energy from the Middle East, right? So incredibly vulnerable position for them. Taking Taiwan flips that on its head, where not only do you now have access to the Pacific, but you also now flip the tables on the United States and start endangering our sea-based lines of communications to Japan, to Korea, to the Philippines, and push us out all the way out to Hawaii, potentially, maybe even further, and really establish yourself as a hegemon in the region. So from both defensive and offensive perspective, Taiwan is really, really important. And the other piece of this is, in modern naval power projection, submarines are very, very critical. Surface ships increasingly become vulnerable. And China has the problem of geography in that their shoreline all around South China Sea and East China Sea is very, very shallow. In the Taiwan Strait, the depth of water is only 300 feet, too shallow to put a submarine in without it being trivially detected. On the other side of the first island chain, on the eastern shore of Taiwan, it's 12,000 feet and goes down even further from there. The Pacific is the world's deepest ocean. So if you want the submarines from the port of Hainan in the south to get out into the Pacific to patrol and shadow U.S. naval fleet and not go through these choke points that are now controlled by U.S. Navy, you need Taiwan. You need the facilities on the eastern side of Taiwan to help you navigate that. So very important. And the last piece, of course, that I've already mentioned is that these men are in their 70s, very ego-driven, both of them, view themselves as reincarnations of the powers of old. I think Putin views himself as a new Peter the Great, born, of course, in the city established by Peter the Great, Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, and Xi Jinping as sort of this new emperor of China, reestablishing the greatness of China after the century of humiliation, and wanting to get credit for it. So very, very similar objectives of both men driving this timeline to accomplish this in the last decade of their power. I think the reason why Putin invaded Ukraine when he did, right, he's been in power since 1999, why take the action in 2022, is that this was the last unfinished business, right? He's tried to take over Ukraine through gray zone tactics all the way back to 2003, 2004, the Orange Revolution, you may recall, obviously 2014, and the Maidan protests. None of it had worked. And he had come out of COVID very much afraid for his own health. We remember the memes with the long tables. Everyone had to test themselves in quarantine for 2 weeks before seeing him. So concerned about his life and thinking about what's left unfinished from what he wanted to accomplish while in power. And this was that last big chunk, most important one, unification with Ukraine. In fact, there's a remarkable interview on YouTube in Russian in 1990 where he is a nobody, like a low-level bureaucrat in the St. Petersburg mayoral administration. He is being interviewed by a local documentarian on all sorts of things related to the Soviet Union collapse and so forth. And he talks about Ukraine, right? This is an obsession. He's nobody. He's not even in the KGB. He is just a bureaucrat in St. Petersburg mayoral administration. And he talks about the catastrophe of losing Ukraine. Not all the other republics, mind you. There are 15 of them. It's Ukraine, right? So it's a long-standing obsession of his, and he felt like he had to finish it before he would pass.
So you've mentioned both Russian and Chinese leaders, and obviously China is a vastly larger economy, but and at this point a larger military. But why should we be more worried about a China that has shown lots of prudence in terms of security affairs as opposed to Russia, which may be, to paraphrase some Cold Warrior, upper volta with nuclear weapons, but which has shown itself to be reckless in a way that Xi hasn't been?
Well, first of all, I disagree that she is not reckless.
Keep disagreeing with me.
Well, just look at the border conflict with India 5 years ago, right? Not an example of restraint.
But
look at the Philippines.
But they've been lobbing shells at each other on the Siachen Glacier for 40 years now.
Sure, but it was relatively peaceful until Xi Jinping came into power. Look at the escalation in South China Sea with the Philippines in particular, but really Vietnam as well, and so forth. Two, it's only a recent phenomenon, really, from Deng Xiaoping days to Hu Jintao, I would argue. So just 3 leaders of China that put on hold their territorial expansionist ambitions and global influence ambitions to build up China, right? And this was Deng Xiaoping's strategy that he coined and told the Chinese public: hide your strength, bide your time. Now, this was known since the 1980s that this was his strategy, but no one bothered asking, who are you hiding your strength from, and what are you biding your time for? In retrospect, that was very, very clearly just a delaying tactic on the part of Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping came into office in 2012 and said, we're done. We're no longer waiting. We're going to accelerate this thing. I want this to happen under my watch. We've waited long enough. But if you go back to the Mao days, they were incredibly disruptive to global affairs. They were funding all kinds of insurgency campaigns in Africa, Maoist insurgencies, invaded Vietnam in 1979, right? So this idea that China's always been this peaceful nation, by the way, go back centuries. I mean, they were incredibly expansionist power. Korea was a colony, and all kinds of conflicts with regional allies, etc. So this idea that China is always peaceful and it's America that's this warmonger.
Okay, so I didn't say that China was always peaceful.
You did. Some do.
Someone might have argued that, but they would be foolish.
Yeah.
No, I'm simply saying that in terms of the conduct of policy, you'd have to say that Putin has been, more of an adventurer than Xi. Launched an enormous invasion with hundreds of thousands of troops, and the Chinese haven't done that yet.
Yeah, right?
I said yet.
And up until 2022, you could say the same thing about Putin, that he was very cautious, that even in 2014, it was covert, not direct support, and all that stuff.
Georgia. There was that.
Very briefly until back, right? So,
Crimea.
But Crimea, even, he tried to do it covertly. He didn't admit that this was Russian troops until a year later. So he was very cautious until he decided to ban caution to the wind. And, that might happen with Xi one day.
So I want to get this, I want to get the audience involved in 1 minute. But we would be remiss if I didn't ask you, so what's the strategy for preventing this, an effort to recapture Taiwan?
Yeah. Well, one, read the book, World on Brink. But I'll try to capture it very briefly. So, two-part strategy. One, we cannot lose Taiwan. It is incredibly strategic. By the way, it's been strategic for many, many decades to U.S. policy. In 1950, long before the age of chips and computing, General Douglas MacArthur called it the unsinkable aircraft carrier because of its geopolitical position in the region, right? So incredibly important. We cannot lose Taiwan for that reason alone. Obviously, semiconductors only amplify its importance. Over 90% of all advanced chips, 40% of all chips, period, get manufactured on the island, something that's not going to change anytime soon. Even just a conflict over Taiwan, even if China loses, will put the world into global depression right off the bat in the first year, right? So incredibly high stakes. We have to deter this at all costs. To do that, we have to do two things. One, we have to build up military power in the Pacific, credible power, to make sure that Xi Jinping will think twice about confronting the United States in the region. Taiwan has to do the same to make themselves more of a porcupine. But two, we have to convince them that we actually will not hesitate to potentially to defend Taiwan. And that means reducing our reliance and dependence on China in areas like critical minerals, semiconductors, and other areas where he feels like he has us by the proverbial something. And
family institution, okay?
Yes, very, very, very important. Secondly, even if Taiwan did not exist as a flashpoint issue, the Cold War would remain. China wants to kick us out, the United States out of the region. That is a longstanding objective for them. We are a Pacific power. We're not leaving the region. We have tremendous interest. First of all, Guam is right there as our territory, but obviously in Japan and the Philippines and Korea, we have significant interests. By the way, Asia in general is incredibly strategic to us from an economic perspective, right? This is where you have almost 40% of the world's GDP, most of the economic growth, most of the world's population, and most of the supply chains. So we are not leaving that region. And that means that we have to ultimately win this Cold War. And just like the first Cold War, winning it, aside from deterring China, just like we deterred the Soviet Union from invading West Berlin, is about economics and ultimately making sure that we win the race of the 21st century in the most critical part of the economy that you can imagine, which is technology. And in particular, in the book, I talk about 4 technologies that I believe are vital for this race for the 21st century. The first one is AI and autonomy, pretty self-explanatory these days for the promise of this technology to be truly revolutionary. The good thing is that we're leading in that area. The second one is space, in particular the access to low Earth orbit that you're seeing right now. Again, thanks to SpaceX, we're leading in that field and capturing most of that real estate in low Earth orbit for communication, for navigation, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, all sorts of capabilities that are being deployed there. The third one is biotech and synthetic biology. And by the way, not just important from a medical science perspective and curing diseases, but literally this could revolutionize material sciences. And imagine being able to invent new energy sources out of new materials that might perhaps be invented through bioengineering. I think AI is going to be crucial in that. Whoever wins the AI race, I think it will win the biotech synthetic biology race. And the last one is energy, and particularly the new energy, renewable resources, nuclear being one of the more important ones, but others as well. And that's where, unfortunately, we're far behind China today, and something that we need to address. So we have to make sure we win that race. We have to make sure that China remains dependent on us, but we are less and less dependent on China. I call this unidirectional entanglement. Incidentally, this is the exact strategy that China has been pursuing for 40 years, right? We now need to flip the tables and pursue that ourselves.
So I said I would turn it over to the audience, but I lied. Because I'm sorry, it's just it's a big softball to me hanging out there. So American policy at the moment doesn't seem to be following the lines that you're discussing, and it's an irony since in addition to being anti-immigrant, Donald Trump rode to power on the China threat. And you talked about Kissinger's conversation with Brezhnev, and the Russians had on a number of occasions sort of put out feelers. How about condominium, as the international relations scholars call it? And Kissinger, by the way, was more pro-condominium than any other Secretary of State we've had, but even he knew that that was a bad idea in that context. I think there are an awful lot of analysts right now who think that what Donald Trump really wants is condominium with the Chinese, spheres of influence. The rumor has been floated that he'll trade Taiwan for a trade deal, which is an astonishing rumor when you think about it. And the fact that he undid essentially 3 to 4 decades of progress in terms of U.S.-Indian rapprochement, while still holding open the door for the Chinese, is all kind of astonishing. So would you say that your prescriptions are even more urgent today than ever because of this, shall we say, retrograde motion?
They're really important. But look, here's the important thing to understand about Donald Trump. He is perhaps the first president we've had in a very, very long time that is completely unideological when it comes to foreign policy, right? On any issue, he can be convinced of this side or the other side, on any day. And by the way, the next day he can be convinced of the opposite, right? Which creates dangers, but also creates opportunities, right? If you're in the room where it happens and have influence and present good arguments, you can get him to change his mind. And in fact, we saw this, right? I remember the headlines in the media in February of 2025, right, this year, with Zelensky in that Oval Office meeting, and everyone saying, "Oh my God, Ukraine is done. You know, this is a disaster." Just a month ago in Alaska, the headlines in the media said, "Oh my God, Putin has won." What did he win exactly? And now we're providing intelligence that President Biden did not provide for long-range strikes into Russia under President Trump. And he's now considering maybe sending Tomahawks. I don't think it will actually happen for a variety of logistical reasons. But what has happened, right? By the way, in 6 months, he could be on the other side again, right? But there is an opportunity to convince him, is my point. And with regards to China, yes, he's seeking an accommodation right now, particularly on the trade deal with Xi Jinping. I don't think he's going to get that deal because I don't think Xi Jinping is interested in that ultimately and making concessions like others have done. So we could find ourselves in this winter or spring in a complete reversal where he's going to be hardcore China hawk again, right? So nothing is ever done with this president. Positively and negatively. Every day is a fight to convince him of the right arguments, but it creates opportunities as well. So it's not done. I don't think that he's got any vision with regards to spheres of influence or accommodation with China. I think it's a very tactical decision. I want a trade deal, but I don't think he actually wants to concede American power. I think he has this grand vision that we're the greatest nation on the planet and the most powerful. I don't think he wants to see that to China at all.
He's been pretty harsh on Taiwan, though.
Well, he did learn in the first term the importance of Taiwan and the sensitivity of Taiwan. You might recall, right after he got elected in 2016, he took a call from the Taiwanese president, President Tsai at the time. This is sort of a customary call that the president of Taiwan always makes to an elected leader of the United States that is usually not answered, right? And he took the call because it's like, oh, she's calling to congratulate me. Why wouldn't I take this call, right? And he learned that was not a good idea because the freak out from Beijing was, nuclear. And he has now told his advisors that this is a very sensitive issue. Anything related to Taiwan, I want to know about because I now learned that is very, very sensitive. So he appreciates the sensitivity. But by the way, he said recently in an interview that Xi Jinping will not invade Taiwan on my watch.
Well, he's nothing if not confident. Okay. Now, who's out there? I'm going to start with Ian. Right here.
Hi, Ian Johnson. I was up until last year I was with the Council on Foreign Relations. And I'd like to ask you a question on Xi Jinping. And so in terms of an invasion of Taiwan, it seems to me that currently that would be a highly risky proposal. Like it could work, but it could well not work. And if you're Xi Jinping, you assume a rational actor, then you wouldn't want to gamble the house on that kind of an invasion. So why do you think it's likely? Do you think he's a rational actor in that? Is he getting the information, or is he getting some amalgam of stuff that people tell him and so on and so forth? And is the risk greater because as he gets older, the people around him are more likely to be yes men or not? I just wonder how you see that.
You're getting me on my favorite pet peeve about rationality in international relations. I think this is a canard. Every actor, every leader on the global stage, I think, is a rational actor fundamentally. And that does not mean they don't make mistakes. I think President Bush II was a rational actor. He invaded Iraq, an act from his perspective of rationality, but also incredible stupidity. Right? President Putin is a rational actor. He invaded Ukraine, an act of stupidity and miscalculation, but not irrational. In fact, it came closer than most people think to accomplishing his goals. And if he had managed to subjugate Ukraine, we'd be sitting here saying what an incredible brilliant strategist he is. So people miscalculate all the time. That is not irrationality. And Xi Jinping is looking at the world where he's saying for the last 40 years, 45 years, we have been modernizing our military, throwing hundreds of billions of dollars a year at the PLA to do one thing and one thing only, which is defeat the United States in the invasion scenario of Taiwan. And by the way, I've now given them an order, as the US intelligence community confirms, to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. So I expect them to be ready whenever I tell them to go. That's not irrational. He may be wrong. He may miscalculate. But the problem with him giving that order is not that he's going to invade in 27. I actually think it's very unlikely he'll invade in 27 itself. But now that he's drawn a line in the sand and he's given that order, whenever he comes to them in 29, 30, 31, whatever, and says, are you ready? Who do you think is going to tell him, no, sir? The order's been given. And now it's not just a career-limiting move, but maybe a life-limiting move to say that we disobeyed your order, sir, right? So he may convince himself, just like Putin convinced himself, just like Bush convinced himself, that this will be easier than he thinks. History is full of smart people miscalculating and ending up in very dangerous situations, disastrous situations.
Not here at the Academy, though. Back here.
Hi. At the beginning of your speech, you mentioned a lot of aspects of the first Cold War, but one that I thought was missing was the way in which the first Cold War essentially drew every other country into the conflict. And so far, we don't see that. So my question for you is, do you see that happening anytime soon?
Well, I disagree with you that it's not happening. It's clearly happening. If you don't believe it's happening, go visit the region. Go visit the Philippines. Go visit Australia. What is AUKUS, if not an anti-China alliance? Go visit Japan, why they just allowed a 3-star general to establish command on the Japanese islands. It is definitely happening in the region. Even here in Europe, right, there's more of an anti-China sentiment, in part because of their support for Russia, in part because of trade issues. But nevertheless, things are changing. And by the way, during the Cold War, the world was not divided into the Soviet bloc and the Western world. There was a huge part of the world that was not aligned. And by the way, who was not aligned? India, Indonesia, Brazil, like some of the same countries that are not aligned today. So it's actually remarkably similar to the first Cold War.
You had a question.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you a question about Pakistan, because China is heavily engaged in Pakistan, building a deep sea port in Gwadar and trying to get access into the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf. How do you see the role of China in countries like Pakistan? Because during the conflict between India and Pakistan, Pakistan was using Chinese technology, India was using French and other technology, and Chinese technology helped Pakistan to not to defeat India, but to restrict. Maybe you can elaborate.
Well, obviously that's a relationship that goes back many decades. They helped them with the nuclear program back in the 70s. They do view them, I think, as a constraining factor in India, right? The nightmare for China is that they go to invade Taiwan, they're fighting a war with the United States, and then India invades from the south, right? Horrible prospect to fight a 2-front war with the United States and India. How do you constrain that? Well, you've got Pakistan. Make India worry about Pakistan, so any adventures with China, they'll deal with Kashmir and the border there. So that's, I think, one of the primary goals, but also just global influence, access to the Middle East through Pakistan, right? Being able to have access to deep water ports for your blue water navy. So there's lots of interest there, also resources. So multifaceted strategy with regards to Pakistan. But look, they're trying to do this everywhere, right? They're trying to build relationships and not alliances. Alliances are the wrong word. They don't have alliances, but partnerships with countries all over, including in our backyard in the Caribbean, right? In Central and South America. So they're doing what the Soviet Union did during the first Cold War. There's really remarkably few differences between the first Cold War and the second.
Yeah. One short question. In case of a war between the United States and China, how long could the United States sustain the war without Chinese supply? Because, for example, if you look on one simple fact, the shipbuilding capacity left in the United States compared with the capacities of China. Thank you.
That's a good question. So we do have problems with capacity. Shipbuilding is one of them, but a bigger issue is actually munitions and torpedoes, missiles, etc. The Chinese also have issues because they depend on raw materials, right? So if they can't get iron ore, I don't care how many factories you have, you've got a problem, right? So it's a problem that can impact both sides. But look, unlike Ukraine, which is a war of attrition, I think it's going to be very difficult to fight a war of attrition over Taiwan because it's going to be a naval battle, right? If you cannot cross the channel, not Taiwan Strait, not the channel, and land your force on Taiwan, if your navy, for example, is at the bottom of the ocean, then what, right? Yeah, you can lob missiles at Taiwan, but strategic bombing never works, never results in submission of populations, quite the opposite. You look at Battle of Blitz, Battle of Britain, and lots of other examples. So, if we manage to sink the Chinese fleet, for example, and that is Admiral Papar's plan, the so-called Hellscape plan, to make Taiwan Strait uninhabitable for Chinese ships, then there's no plan B, right? If you don't land, you don't land. It's not like land invasion over the borders of Ukraine where you can keep resupplying and throwing bodies at the problem. So that's the fundamental issue that China has. Amphibious invasions are the most difficult form of military operations by far. China has never attempted any of this. Only one country has done it at scale, and it's the United States. First in World War II with D-Day, then the landing at Incheon during the Korean War. One interesting thing is that there's only two countries in the last 100 years that have thought very seriously about invading Taiwan. One is China, one is the United States. In 1944, the US military drew up plans to invade Formosa, as Taiwan was called at the time, because it was occupied by Japanese forces, 60,000 Japanese forces, right? 2 months after D-Day, in August of 1944, after the most successful amphibious invasion in human history, and the largest, right? 150,000 Allied troops crossing the English Channel, about the width of Taiwan Strait, landing on the beaches of Normandy and leading to the liberation of Europe. The US military puts together this plan. It called for double the number of forces we use in Normandy, just against 60,000 Japanese defenders on that island, through a pincer movement campaign from both mainland China and the Philippines, which China doesn't have, right? And ultimately, because of the levels of casualties that the US military estimated would suffer, 45,000 during the course of a 2-month brutal campaign on that island to subjugate it, Roosevelt, MacArthur, and others said, no, this is too hard. For the US military that has just pulled off the greatest amphibious invasion in history, this was too complex, too hard, too risky 81 years ago. It has only gotten infinitely harder since then because of advancements in long-range weapons, ISR, all sorts of capabilities, drones. So, and China, of course, does not have that experience. There's no one in Chinese military, in the PLA, that's wearing the uniform that has any combat experience whatsoever and any intensity, right? So this is very, very difficult for them. And we need to make sure it's near impossible.
Volker. Thanks. War over Taiwan will mean a depression, you said, and you mean a global depression, I suppose. And that's a point where European business and industry totally agrees with you. Against that backdrop, do you have a word to say about the security role of European countries in the situation that you've described?
Well, look, I really don't understand European strategy on China, to be honest with you, and particularly German strategy. What is the top German industry, right? It's automotive. It is about to get absolutely destroyed by China, right? Even if you look at just the Chinese market itself, Volkswagen lost 70% of their revenues in China in the last 3 years. BMW, 30% in the last 3 years. That is going to zero for two reasons. One, that in every single industry over the last 40 years, the Chinese strategy has been, let's let the Western companies in, let's learn from them, let's steal their IP, let's build comparable products that are better or cheaper or both, and ultimately dominate first in China and then globally. Every single industry. What is the one company in the world, technology company, that has unbelievable brand power, that people buy their products simply because of brand? Apple, right? Apple lost 15% of their sales in China in the last 2 years. Apple is losing in China. There's no one that can compete with Apple on brand power. And yet they're losing. No company, Western company, will be allowed to succeed in China. And particularly not in automotive sector, where China now, unfortunately, has the best product in EVs by far. Not only is it cheaper, it is unbelievable capabilities. The battery technology that they're developing, particularly in solid state, absolutely game changer. The self-driving technology, other things. This is a by far the better product. They're going to destroy German car makers, first in China, it's already happening, and then worldwide, except the United States because we won't let them in because we're protectionist. But I'm like, what is the strategy here? Why are you going all in on China when they're going to kick you out and they're going to destroy your domestic market as well? This is just baffling to me, and it, unfortunately, reminds you a lot of the attitudes towards Russia and the reliance on energy. And I understand that Europe doesn't have a lot of options, and particularly with a trade war with the United States, the American market is not so lucrative at this point as well, unfortunately. But reliance on China is just foolhardy because it will not succeed, and you'll be much worse in the long term. And we have 40 years of history in every single area of technology and manufacturing where that's proven true. So this time it's going to be different.
But I think the question was on the security role specifically, was it not? So, so why don't you take that on?
Well, just briefly, obviously there's a lot of concern in Europe about Donald Trump and commitment to NATO and so forth, and I get that. But here's the reality, and I've been going to Munich Security Conference for 15 years, and I've been telling my friends here in Europe and in the defense and national security world for 15 years that if the United States is at war with China in the Indo-Pacific, every single enabler and critical asset, like tankers, like ISR assets, bombers, fighter jets that we have in Europe, is going to go to the Pacific. I don't care who the president is. I don't care how ironclad their commitment to NATO is. We're going to need it all because this is going to be an existential fight in the Pacific with China. And Europe is going to be left naked because without our enablers in particular and logistics, most importantly, it's going to be in real trouble. So this is not even about U.S. commitment to Europe. It's just about the reality that we don't have the capacity to fight a two-front war. Hopefully, we have a capacity to fight a one-front war. But this is why Europe needs to step up. And in case U.S. is engaged in a war in the Indo-Pacific, it's not that we're going to ask Europe to contribute. We've got it. What we'll ask is take care of Putin, right? If he decides to do something adventurous here on this continent, we're not going to be able to help you, even if we want to. And you're going to be left on your own.
Oh, now the hands are coming up. I see. Well, I feel a need to be an equal opportunity caller honor. Back, all the way back in the middle of the Wannsee. Yeah.
Hi. You sort of preempted my question because NATO Secretary Rutte warned a few weeks ago that there's the likelihood that China will act in the same time as Russia. So I would be just curious to hear what you think on that specific likelihood.
Yeah, look, China and Russia do not have an alliance. It's a very transactional relationship. Let me just give you one stat. So Russia has been very active, really over the last 10, 15 years now, but particularly in the last few years, prosecuting spies, people that they're accusing of spying for various nations. The number one accusation indictments of spying is for China, of people being arrested in Russia. With friends like these, who needs enemies, right? It's a very transactional relationship. It's certainly not a friendship without limits. In fact, we're seeing real limits to all of this playing out on a daily basis. China will not lift a finger to help Russia unless it's in its own self-interest. And I think the vice versa is true as well. I don't think that that Putin gave Xi a heads up on Ukraine. I don't think he gave Most of his own generals didn't know that he was invading Ukraine. The idea that he would tell Xi is being the paranoid guy that he is and concerned about U.S. penetrations, I don't think is credible. So I don't think they're going to do some sort of coordination. Hey, I'm going to take Taiwan. You go invade the Baltics or something like this. But look, if Xi goes for it and the U.S. is distracted, then Putin is nothing but an opportunist. He might say, well, now is a great time to do something. Not that they're going to coordinate a priori, but, an opportunity may open up. I don't think he actually planned to take Crimea until he saw an opportunity to do so, and the Maidan gave him that opportunity, right? So this is what he does. He sees an opening and he jumps on it, and that's the danger.
Okay. All right. This woman right here, we've had way too many men.
Yes. I'd just like to know whether you agree with me on something. I'm Chinese, but I'm not from the People's Republic of China. And you talk a lot about...
Are you from the Republic of China?
Not exactly. Yes and no. Hong Kong, okay, which was British at the time that we fled. China, I feel, has always had selfish aims. I can say that, being Chinese. I could say bad things about the Chinese, okay?
By the way, every nation is selfish at the end of the day, so let's not make it unique about China.
But what, I think makes the United States very different from China or Russia. It's not economic power or military power, but it is, shall I say, humanitarian values that are different, because I see the United States as a beacon of hope. It's a country that people want to immigrate to. I mean, the people who won, I know that Nobel Prize winners, some of them were Chinese originally, but they won the Nobel Prize for the United States. The US is a place of innovation. It is a place of, even Germans aspire to be American as well. And maybe I just believe, maybe I just am optimistic, and I believe that the good side will win. I just think that the US, what makes the country great, is, I wasn't at yesterday's lecture about democracy, okay, but it's still a democratic country. So, I mean, do you agree or disagree with me?
Look, at the end of the day, yes, values are important, but national interests always prevail, right? Even as we talked about democracy and freedom around the world during the first Cold War, we could clearly compromise on those objectives in lots of different places, aligned with dictators and brutal folks in furtherance of tactical objectives of containing the Soviet Union, right? And by the way, in some cases, it was probably the right decision. So, values are important, but at the end of the day, when existential interests are at stake, they're going to be fallen by the wayside, I think, in any country. And it's important to, you're not going to ask, particularly now, but it's really hard, I think, in any situation, to ask American people to go die for freedom or democracy somewhere else. Now, it's just unimaginable. But you can ask them to die for their interests and the way of life and prosperity and security. And that's what this argument in the Cold War has to be based on. Not just with this administration, but if you want to get the American people on your side, this is the core of the issue. I've been on this book tour, not just internationally, but all over the United States, and not just the East Coast and the West Coast, but all over Middle America, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Tampa, Florida, Charlotte, North Carolina, Middle America, and doing Rotary clubs, doing book clubs and other things, and seeing a lot of military families that in almost every case, they would ask me, why should my son or daughter die for this? It's a really, really hard question to answer. I can talk till I'm blue in the face about the strategic importance of Taiwan and semiconductors and all of that. It's really hard to look them in the eye and say your son and daughter should go die for this, right? So values are important, but they're not enough.
So if I can just interject a question here. You've been raising the alarm about China now for quite some time, and I'm wondering, and you've studied a lot what we've done with China, how we've interacted with China. You noted Obama's remark before, but I'm curious what your observation is about American strategic culture that we were so late to recognize the conflict we have with China. And in this case, I mean, one of the things that comes through in your book is that there may be a little stronger streak of realpolitik in a Russian immigrant than there is in many Americans, but you tell me.
Well, look, it's on par with our history to be always late to recognize, as you well know, counterterrorism and the threat of Al-Qaeda. I write about the history of the Cold War and my view on the first Cold War, that it didn't start in 1945 or 1946 with Churchill's speech in Fulton, Missouri, or 1947 when a New York Times journalist nicknamed it the Cold War. It started in 1918 with the end of the hot war between Russia and America, when the United States intervened in one of our long litany of unfortunate interventions in the Russian Civil War. We lost, the Bolsheviks won, and we forgot promptly all about that intervention. About 500 Americans died in that conflict. The Bolsheviks didn't forget. They came away with that, and I cite the literature, in 1918, 1919, 1920, with an understanding that they're in an existential fight with the West, first and foremost, Britain, still the global power, but United States not far behind. And Lenin and Stalin came away completely convinced that communism will not survive without defeating capitalism, right? And that was the start of, by the way, an economic espionage campaign. KGB set up an effort in the GRU to steal intellectual property from the United States and UK and Germany and others. Does that sound familiar? Later, military secrets, right? So they brought in Western industrialists to transfer technology. So you may remember, if you followed the Ukrainian conflict closely, that there was this huge battle in the city of Mariupol at the opening months of the war. And the Ukrainian defenders in that southern city holed up in this huge steel facility called Azovstal, one of the largest steel facilities in the world, until they ultimately surrendered. That facility is an exact copy of a steel plant built in Gary, Indiana. And in the 1930s, Stalin invited American industrialists to come in the Soviet Union and replicate that steel plant, because why wouldn't you build steel facilities to procure tanks, to build tanks and aircraft for the Soviet Union? They knew what they were doing. We didn't, right? So this is a long history for the Americans to think that trade and economic integration trumps everything, security interests, particularly with authoritarian regimes, and we tend to pay for that down the road. Even, by the way, a great story I write about in the book, in 1946, so after the Churchill speech, right, the Iron Curtain has descended upon Eastern Europe. The Soviets are building their first jet fighter, the MiG-15. They stole a lot of technologies, well, not stole, they conquered a lot of technology, obviously, from Germany, but they cannot figure out the engines. They're having problems with their indigenous engines. And Mikoyan, Artem Mikoyan, the trade minister, whose brother is the Mikoyan, who's the Yaman MiG, goes to Stalin and says, General Secretary, we really need the British engines, the Rolls-Royce engines. You know what Stalin says? Which fool is going to sell their enemy these strategic engines? Well, it turns out the British Party, the Labour Party in Britain, was more than happy to authorize the sale of Rolls-Royce engines to the MiG-15s that were promptly reverse engineered, became the Plymouth engines. They're now powering Russian aircraft to this day. But just 4 years later, those MiG-15s, flown by Soviet pilots in the MiG alley in the Korean War, shot down 115 American pilots, right? This is the lessons that we tend to keep learning over and over again, unfortunately, in these conflicts.
Sure. Just wait for the mic, please.
A short question, because we didn't talk about this North Korea. How does North Korea fit in this situation? Sending ten thousands of soldiers to fight in Ukraine, it's helping Putin or helping Xi, and also all the atomic power and missiles which they are building. So there must be some strategy there, because China can control all of it, and still it's working.
Yeah, China does not control North Korea. It wishes it could. A lot of people wish it could. But in fact, the relationship between North Koreans and Chinese is very fraught, in part because the North Koreans resent the dependence that they have on China and poke them at any chance they get. In fact, the United States has a long history of proxies of ours not behaving in the way we like. So we can sympathize a little bit with the Chinese on this front. But look, North Koreans are transactional as anybody, ruthlessly transactional. I think the North Koreans actually have had the most brilliant foreign policy of any country in the last 50 years. They know how to use blackmail and threats and aggression just enough to deter action against them and to get everything they want without conceding a thing, and playing off great powers against each other. Kim Il-sung pioneered the strategy, and his successors have absolutely mastered it. But I actually think that North Korea presents a very unique opportunity for Donald Trump. I wrote a piece on this in New York Times in December of last year, saying that this is the one thing that people are not paying attention to, where you could actually get Donald Trump, and he's the one president that could do it, to do a peace deal with North Korea. Now, the key, and it actually came fairly close last time. The stumbling block was the long-held insistence from the United States on denuclearization of North Korea, which is something that will never happen. Nuclear weapons are the ultimate guarantor of regime survival in North Korea. They're never giving them up. They now have over 50 nuclear weapons. They're building a triad. No country that has achieved this level of development of nuclear weapons has ever given them up. And I don't think it will happen with North Korea. But if you sort of set that aside and don't accept it, but acknowledge that they're a nuclear power effectively, you can still get a lot done. You can get verifiable non-proliferation commitments, because what do we care about? Not just that North Korea has nuclear weapons, but we don't want them spreading them around the world for cash. You can get them to stop testing nuclear weapons, which is good for humanity. You can perhaps get them to curtail their aggressive missile launches that are threatening Japan and South Korea. You can get them to stop maybe the cyber activity that they're engaging in, and work towards demilitarization of the DMZ in exchange for full recognition, establishment of diplomatic relations with North Korea. I think Donald Trump is the one person that could get it done. He's got a good personal relationship with Kim, as just confirmed by Kim himself a week ago. He said in an interview that he likes Donald Trump and had a great relationship with him, right? He, by the way, the Biden administration tried to reach out to him to continue the talks that the Trump administration initiated. He had no interest, zero interest. But Trump, I think, if he reaches out, in fact, there's this amazing story. So you remember there were two summits in Singapore and Hanoi, and then there was this impromptu summit where Trump was in Osaka in Japan for the G20, and he tweets without any sort of preparation of like, "Hey, Kim, I'm in the region. I'm going to stop by and meet you in 24 hours at the DMZ." No sort of, our folks are going to meet, establish an agenda, none of that. Guess what? Kim shows up. They have a handshake. Trump famously steps into the North Korea and so forth, right? So, I don't think any other president could have done that. I don't think any other president would have done that. But, there is value in that. And I think Trump will have a lot more leeway with Republicans in Congress also to do a deal like that than a Democratic president would ever do. So what would that accomplish? That would not bring North Korea into U.S. orbit, right? North Korea is not interested in being in anyone's orbit, but it would enable us to try to pull them away somewhat from China and Russia. Now they would triangulate against all three powers. This would unnerve China to no end. This would allow the South Koreans to focus more on China rather than just be obsessed about North Korea as they are today. It would transform our power position in the region, and I think would be good for the world. So and by the way, may actually get him a Nobel Peace Prize, right? So there's lots of reasons to do it, and I think they'll actually try to pursue it. But the key thing is understanding that if you make it contingent on denuclearization, you'll get absolutely nowhere.
It's right here on the aisle.
Thank you. Ivo Reginka happened to be a banking lawyer out of this field, but nevertheless, very interesting speech. Two questions. What is currently required on behalf of China in order to be as capable from their point of view to flip the geostrategic picture, not only in the region, but worldwide, meaning to end American supremacy? How far is China, in their view, away, given on how many fields they happen to be still way behind the United States in developing, be it in space, be it in whatever region? And secondly, an optimistic outlook, perhaps, aren't we even perhaps a bit closer to some sort of balance of power in worldwide, establishing a new regime, perhaps, between all those hegemons, be it Russia, be it China, be it Iran, be it whatever, you name it, and on the other side, the Americans with the Quad and the AUKUS alliance? Thanks.
So just to turn you are pro-Cold War. Yeah. Well, what about the Cuban Missile Crisis and other very dangerous, almost luckily misses? So, look, with regards to China, I think actually Xi Jinping is completely misreading the situation. He thinks China is way stronger than it actually is, and America is way weaker. Putin, by the way, is making the same mistake about the West. And that's a good thing. I want them to misunderestimate us. I want him to overestimate the time he's got, right, to achieve this, because I actually think their trajectory is on the decline now. The demographic problems, the fundamental misalignment of the economy, right? There are four things that have driven China's rise since the 1970s, right? People, now a declining resource. The demographics are already declining and will accelerate in the 2030s. Natural resources, which they're dependent on, oil, iron ore, etc., to be traversed from allied countries like Australia, but also through waterways that are controlled by U.S. Navy. Really problematic. Access to foreign markets, which are increasingly challenged, not just because of the trade war with the United States, but tariffs that Europeans are now considering. But even Brazil, Turkey, India are all putting up trade barriers because no one wants to see their domestic manufacturing bases being decimated by Chinese overcapacity, right? And foreign capital as the last element, which is already diminishing. Foreign direct investments into China is down year over year for the last 3 years, right? So all four pillars of their success are now being reversed. The economy, as you well know, is incredibly unbalanced, right? Real estate, which is incredibly unproductive with all these ghost cities and overcapacity, et cetera, is 30% of their GDP, 30% of their GDP. At the height of 2008 craziness in the United States, real estate was 11% of our GDP, right? This is enormous bubble that they keep feeding and with stimulus package that they keep authorizing. So lots of really systemic issues that they're facing with no real solutions, which is why Xi does not really want to rock this boat and is hoping that the rest of the world is going to bail him out with his overcapacity and dumping practices. But it's not going to work because it's not even just the United States. It's the rest of the world doesn't want this. And one of the things that the Trump administration is doing with this global trade war that we're engaged in is actually making it even harder for them. What is happening with the trade deal with Vietnam? They are preventing transshipment of Chinese goods through Vietnam because of tariffs that they're placing directly on that transshipment, right? So cutting off huge way into the United States through Vietnam for China. So things are not rosy at all for them, but I actually think that Xi Jinping, because he's not very interested in economics, he's a true Marxist-Leninist that thinks that top-down economies work. Unlike, by the way, Deng Xiaoping, who was much smarter about this stuff. And that's a good thing. Let him keep running China's economy into the ground and buying us time to do the right things to deter the invasion of Taiwan and ultimately defeat them.
So I think that's a great place to end. Unfortunately, those of you with your hands up in the back will have a chance to buttonhole our speaker momentarily. But I think that that's also a really important place to end, because so many of the things that I think most historians would say went wrong in the Cold War were largely due to an overestimation of the other side, which was a chronic problem. I'll just say, I remember when the wall came down and we started getting access to all kinds of interesting information. The Defense Intelligence Agency of the U.S. had estimated East German GDP at 105% or 103% of West German GDP. And anyone who lived through the period afterward knows how correct that was. So it is a chronic problem of great powers to overestimate their enemies. There's some utility.
In fairness, we can barely estimate our GDP, so.
Yeah. Well, at this point, we can't estimate anything because everything's shut down. But anyway, I think what you just heard, though, and what you've heard throughout this evening is a fantastic reflection of Dmitri's wide-ranging intelligence. And the book is the man. I mean, it's incredible how much you sound like your book. Astonishing. Unlike some people who've had books written for them, but it's a really terrific book.
Scars to show for it.
It's a terrific book. I highly recommend it. I think you got a great taste of it this evening. And as I said, the podcast is there as well for your delectation. So I really want to thank Dmitri for joining us here tonight.
Thank you so much for having me, for being a good sport. I think a little bit of a back and forth is always good in these.
Yeah, no, I'm used to being a punching bag. It's okay.
I love to debate almost any topic, but you run an incredible institution. Thank you for really insightful questions. It's really a great pleasure to be here and great honor.
Wonderful. Well.